So we have to contend right now with where things are at in this moment. Like from an investor standpoint, how do you think about this? Are you like, well, I'm going to ride the bubble while I can, and then I'm going to, as I get the gains, I'm going to rebalance out of the high risk stuff into the safety and liquidity of the bond market? Like, how do you navigate this reality knowing the future remains a bunch of question marks?
Well, that's it. I mean, that's why there's so much demand for safety and liquidity. And it's not just in bonds. I mean, why is gold gone vertical, at least, up until earlier this year? Gold went vertical because a lot of people around the entire world, China's a big one, could sense that the system is breaking down. It doesn't seem to work. Therefore, you want some kind of asset that, historically speaking, has been something that's able to bridge from A to B, because that's what we're really talking about. We are stuck in A. We're not going to get out of A anytime soon. We can see B. We can see the possibility of reaching B, and B would be really, really good. We can also see C, which would be really, really bad. But between A and B and maybe C, there's going to be a whole lot of uncertainty in between. That's the allure of gold and other instruments that act in the same way, safe haven demand. So when you're looking at this level of uncertainty, understanding what the risks are, where we actually are, not just following along with the mainstream narrative about how everything is fine and we're, the economy is resilient and strong and all that kind of stuff. You really do want to be. And I'm not saying you do. I'm not saying you want to sit out the marketplace. I'm not saying you don't want to own stocks or you don't want to own risky assets, but you want to be mindful when you do. Always understanding that this uncertainty, by its very nature, is unpredictable. And unpredictable means that it can show up tomorrow and be something that you were not prepared for, which is one reason why you want to have some kind of allocation to safe havens and safety, whatever that actually means. It depends on your own individual circumstances. But that's the reason why, again, depression economics. The reason why safety becomes in such demand during depression economics is because of the uncertainty. And now the uncertainty leads toward, probabilities that are skewing to the downside rather than the upside. In fact, that's the single biggest thing which distinguishes depressionary conditions. It's not the negative numbers. When you say the term depression, I just did a video on this. When you say depression, a lot of people think what you're saying is it's a big recession. Because you think, 1930s, you had the great collapse between 29 and 32. And so that's what you're talking about when you talk about a depression. No, the depression was not 29 to 32. It was 32 to 41. It was the lack of upside. And when you have a situation where there's a lack of upside in the real commercial system, not talking about financial upside, but in the real commercial system, that's a high degree of uncertainty that leads to more frequent downside cases than maybe you're prepared for. So under depressionary conditions, demand for safety, which is multifaceted, it never leaves your thinking. I'm not saying you don't want to put all your money into gold or all your money into bonds, but you do want to at least have some idea, or at least some good, useful handle on how you're going to protect yourself from that uncertainty, knowing that the uncertainty is always there. Don't fall into the trap where you fool yourself into thinking GDP is positive. The payroll report looked pretty good. Therefore, nothing could be possibly wrong, because that's really not the case. There's both short run as well as long run changes that are taking place, and we really have no idea how those are going to play out over time.
Speaking of that, so you painted a picture, a decentralized future where we reboot the system with a new kind of ledger that people can really trust. I want to contrast that with what I think China is doing, and I'll be very curious to see if you have the same read. So China recently clamped down on paper gold trading. And the way that I interpret that is they are trying to get a bunch of gold physically present in China. So they know that there's still appetite for gold among the Chinese population, but if they can't trade paper, then they're going to buy the physical asset. China, as a central bank, has been hoovering up gold in massive quantities, but I imagine the Chinese people could do a lot more. China could very easily turn that into a one-way valve so that gold gets into the country but can't get back out. For people that don't know, gold works in a very similar fashion to reserve banking in that you don't necessarily need, you definitely don't need a one-to-one gold bar for every paper trading on it. So you can get into, whatever 10 to 1, whatever the real number is on that. And so if I'm China and I'm like, I want to get out from under the dollar, I want the yuan to be the reserve currency, but I know I'm going to have to do something to reset the system. So I'm going to get enough gold that I could peg it, even if it's not one-to-one, but that I could peg it to the yuan and over time take over the status as the reserve currency, even if they had to partner with another country to say, listen, we're going to hold the gold in some sort of corridor where it's not physically in China, but it's like in different places with a partner country or something. Am I crazy, or do you see them grappling with the same thing that you're talking about, where we need a reset system, but they're just looking backwards instead of forwards to a new technology?
Well, the Chinese are in an interesting position because they're one of the biggest. They're one of the ones who have the biggest downside from the dollar system. It is, and I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the economic consequences. China's in a lot more trouble than people think. People realize they have a banking crisis and a property crisis that are going on in parallel. And it's getting really dicey over there in the real economy. In fact, the 5-year plan that just came out just completely omitted their employment targets for the next 5 years because they're not really sure they can actually hit them. But setting that aside, that just creates some kind of the Chinese have the biggest interest in trying to do something different. The problem for them is they can't, because when you're talking about a reserve currency, it's not as simple as pegging a currency to a gold bar. Because you got to remember what made the Eurodollar system and a reserve currency, this is true of any reserve currency, what it is its mobility. Gold by its very nature is not mobile. And to have a currency become truly mobile, which means it has to be available as many places as possible, and it has to be acceptable as many places as possible. And those two things do not describe anything of China, whether it be finance or money. So the Chinese realize they have zero chance of creating a reserve currency. Even if they could create a currency that could theoretically be available, not many people are going to want to take it, which kind of undermines the entire point of a reserve currency. So what the Chinese are really trying to do is make the best of a bad situation. So they're building up their gold reserves. So, and part of it is just mechanical. One of the reasons they're building up gold reserves is because they have tons of dollars coming into the country. Ever since 2024, they made a tactical strategy to basically dump their excess production on the rest of the world in order to save employment. The Chinese internal economy, as it becomes an increasingly a mess, leads to this imbalance between supply and demand, which is why China has been suffering from deflationary conditions since 2023, because they produce way too much for them to be able to absorb for the internal demand. So they take the rest of their excess production and just fling it around the rest of the world, charging whatever they can charge, which means, among other things, when you're selling more goods to the rest of the world, you've got a lot of more dollars coming back, because almost everything is traded in dollars. And it doesn't have to be dollars. You could invoice in euros. You're going to end up with dollars anyway, because dollars are the reserve currency. So they have a flood, an absolutely biblical flood of dollars available to China. You got to do something with them. Now, normally what happened in the 1990s and 2000s, when they had a flood of dollars coming in, they took those dollars and reinvested them internally in the Chinese economy. They built factories, they built roads, they built glittering cities. They tried to transform the country from a subsistence agriculture one to a modern industrial society, and they were partially successful. They got kind of halfway through the system before 2008 hit. But these days, they have the export boom. They've got dollars available, but really no appetite to do anything with them. So in many ways, they're buying gold because what else are they going to do with the money that they have? They don't want to put it in. They don't want to invest it locally, which is as much a commentary on the situation in the Chinese economy as anything else. So, and they don't want to buy in U.S. treasuries because there's a political thing there. We can't buy more treasuries because we're at war with the United States, or at least we're no longer strategic allies. So gold is the perfect solution, because it gives you the idea, or it gives you the possibility of owning a safe haven at the same time, during an uncertain period. But it's also potentially useful if you actually have to. So gold is, for them, it's a pretty good bridge solution for where they are today in the conditions that they have. But as far as replacing the dollar, they gave up on that a long time ago. We're talking more than 10 years ago. There was a flirtation with making the yuan more like the Eurodollar, which would be offshore focused and elastic. That was around 2010 and 2011. They created CNH, which is offshore yuan, in Hong Kong. But they realized very quickly that wasn't going to work. And again, the bigger problem for them is to make a reserve currency workable, it has to be available everywhere and it has to be acceptable everywhere. China doesn't want to make the yuan available everywhere, because that would mean it would be outside of the authorities' control. And as far as being acceptable everywhere, that's just never going to happen, because one of the underappreciated parts of the Eurodollar and any reserve currency system, it's not just currency, whether it's ledger currency or physical paper or gold nuggets or gold coins. It's also all the stuff that comes along with it. I'm talking about arbitration, contract, respect for law. That is incredibly important. The system that's in place that actually arbitrates disputes. Nobody's going to own a Chinese yuan, because if you get in a dispute in yuan terms with a Chinese state-owned company, who's going to win? Doesn't matter what contract you have. One of the secrets behind the Eurodollar system, what's been able to hold on as long as it has, is because whatever you think about the U.S. legal system, and it's far from perfect, the respect for contracts and contract law is right at the center of everything. So if you have a contract with the U.S. government, chances are the U.S. government is going to have to obey the contract, because the independent courts will back that up. You're not going to have the same type of leverage and leeway with the Chinese system. In fact, we know that because with the developers that have defaulted over the last couple of years, whether it be Evergrande or some of the other ones, the Chinese have repeatedly torn up contracts, repeatedly tried to move bankruptcy proceedings inside of mainland China. So, I mean, point is, and the reserve currency, China will not allow the currency to be elastic enough that it's available where it needs to be everywhere to be reserve currency, and nobody's going to want a Chinese yuan anyway. So they have given up on the idea of a reserve currency and instead are trying to deal with the situation that they have as best as they possibly can.
The portfolio that performs in one economic regime can get crushed in the next. So in this free webinar, we're going to reveal what those 4 economic regimes are, how to identify them, as well as the assets, historically speaking, best positioned to perform in every environment. So reserve your seat now and learn how to prepare your portfolio before the economy shifts again.